Good evening and welcome back. So, the official post-mortem of George Floyd says it was a homicide. Is that for the post-mortem to decide? Well, not really, because the idea of a post-mortem is, of course, to decide what the cause of death is. It is not to then attribute motive to how the person died. As in, you could say, this person died from asphyxiation, for example, they broke the hyoid bone. It is then down to the other circumstances and the police to use that information to then decide if it was perhaps suicide or a murder or perhaps an accident or perhaps manslaughter, because you need the greater context. So you can get the cause of death, but you cannot decide what the motive was behind what caused the death in the first place. The autopsy, the post-mortem, is simply down to decide what is responsible for killing the person. So in this instance, you might decide, okay, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Therefore, let's say we know that the police officer knelt on the neck of this gentleman, in which case, if he died from asphyxiation, if he died from a lack of oxygen to the brain, because the officer was cutting off either his oxygen supply or his blood supply, you have a slight difference between air chokes and blood chokes. If you wish to try that on yourself, by all means go ahead. The difference is if you apply pressure to the front of your neck or to the side of the neck. If it's to the side, it still has to be to the front. Basically, feel the pulse where it is on the right side of your neck. Do the equal thing on the opposite side and then squeeze. You will feel that it kind of squeezes your vocal cords, your larynx, and it's difficult to speak and it's difficult to breathe. And eventually you would pass out if you were to do that to yourself. Obviously, you wouldn't be able to keep up the pressure and you would then come around again once oxygen has returned to the brain. Otherwise, do it to the front of your neck. You're blocking your trachea off then, and you won't be able to speak at all because you can't get any oxygen at all. That is far more unpleasant to be in as a situation, basically. But they're the two differences. If you want to try an air choke and a blood choke, then by all means do that to yourself. That is what would be suggested here. Where the policeman's foot or knee was on the neck of George Floyd, it will be closest to a blood choke. Trying to do that one side is basically impossible because the neck narrows down at the front, and therefore you cannot choke somebody out with pressure on just one side because the jaw and the shoulder would get in the way of the neck being compressed the other side on the ground. So it's pretty much impossible to be able to choke somebody out by doing that. If it was on the front, then yes, of course you can, and you can break the trachea by just shunting it very, very forcefully. Then yes, by all means you can break that and therefore block it out by the cartilage within somebody's neck, as is shown in action films as it happens. I believe Bruce Willis did it in the film Red. But nonetheless, that is definitely feasible. But by just leaning on somebody's neck like that, it is not advised, of course not. And this also goes down to why people should be trained more into the effect that they can have on people. Almost similar to MAD, but it goes along with it within martial arts training. You have a great hierarchy, you have a great lot of discipline, you have the authority behind it, because you have to be aware of how dangerous you can be. And therefore, there are far fewer bone-breaking incidents of people at the high levels than the lower levels, especially in something like jiu-jitsu, which is basically what the police officer was failing to do in this instance. That is where it's all about holds and applying pressure and not forcefully. It's grappling instead of striking, and that is what police need to be more trained in. And I know Jocko does loose training in those regards for police officers, because it is vital that a police officer can control the suspect without causing any harm and be in control of the situation without harming the culprit. That is vital. You need to be able to take control of the situation without inflicting harm. This isn't just for police and suspects or culprits or criminals. This is for any aspect of your life. You need to be able to take control of the situation without hurting anybody. That is a vital skill. And therefore, by lowering PT requirements for women, and I know as a man who did it, but nonetheless it's still a valid point, that you don't allow such a situation to take place. Because if you have somebody who doesn't have the strength to control the situation, then they have to respond with more lethal force and something that is far more aggressive, and they have to use striking and momentum or guns or weapons in order to equal the playing field, in order to have a fighting chance. And that is where damage, more often than not, occurs. And therefore, you need to train police in order to be able to detain people without hurting them. And BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is a fantastic example of this in order to grapple somebody, take them down to the floor, take control of them without harming them. That is very important. And I know people say, oh, but martial arts doesn't have any place in street fights. Quite possibly, but we're not really talking about street fights. Instead, we're talking about taking control of one person when you have a group of, let's say, 5 of you. So if you can hold them down, then that's it. If they're resisting far too much and you're at risk of your own life, and therefore you can get on the back of them, roll them over to choke them out so they're unconscious for 10 seconds, take control of them again, and then if they're still restraining or still fighting your restraints, then again, roll them, choke them out for another 10 seconds, come back, and rinse and repeat. But at that point, you should be able to restrain them, and nobody has been seriously hurt. Yes, of course, the culprit will be a bit annoyed that they've lost consciousness for a few bouts of 10 seconds, but that is all that is necessary. You can make somebody unconscious without killing them, and that is something that really needs to be hammered home for the police. And if it is the case that, oh, but this kind of training costs money, that they're going to be having to have classes every month in order to refine these skills. So, okay, fine, they're going to have classes. How much is it? For an hour session, let's say it's $10 per officer per month. That's it. They're earning tens of thousands of dollars a year, and we're saying it's $120 a year. Is it really going to make a difference? No, it isn't. Not at all. Is it feasible? Yes, it definitely is. Could it be a requirement for the police officers to have to go through, at the very least, an extensive crash course? No, that's perfectly fine. And if they don't pass these tests of being able to restrain somebody, then they don't get to be a police officer, or they don't get to be an officer in the field, and instead they're sat behind a desk and they're doing reconnaissance work instead. That's perfectly fine. But if you're in the field, you have to be able to have the skills in order to control the situation of a culprit of which you find yourself having to detain. It is as simple as that. Otherwise, bad things happen, as we've seen here. You need to be able to know the effect of your power. You need to know how strong you are and the effects that you can have if you abuse your power. And if you don't have that humility and you don't have the accuracy of your knowledge, then you're either overpowered because you think you're better than you are, or you maim, seriously injure, or even kill somebody else because you're not aware of how lethal you can be. That is why more education is definitely the answer, in order to make sure that everybody knows where they stand and there is a definitive standard that everybody has to adhere to in order to be a police officer in the field. It is really as simple as that. And then you can actually get back to police being more respected, because people know that they're not just hanging by the convenience store eating donuts all day, but instead they are trained to very demanding physical standards in order to be police officers in the field. That police need to be a force that is respected and also slightly feared. That it needs to be something whereby criminals are afraid of the police and law-abiding citizens respect them. They need to know that they can trust the police, not only to protect them, but also to admonish, detain and arrest any criminal. That is the role of the police. That is exactly what they are there for. Not just to rely on a weapon which may or may not be reliable and therefore hurt somebody more so than necessary. So, for the case in point, they found that the official report, because we've got two different ones, one from the state and one privately hired by Floyd's family. So from the state, it listed Mr. Floyd's cause of death as cardiopulmonary, so heart arrest, as in stop. They say it's so fancy to try and pick themselves up. Okay, the heart stopped. Brilliant. Complicating law enforcement, subdual, restraint, and neck compression. Right. So the heart stopped. This was complicated by, so kind of brought on by, the police stopping him, holding him down, and pinning him down by his neck. That's what it means. Just say it like that. The examination also showed he had heart disease and recent drug use. Yes, and he was known to the police. He wasn't an innocent guy, not by any means, and he was being restrained. The findings of the official post-mortem were released shortly after those of a private examination carried out by medical examinators hired by the Floyd family, which of course found exactly what they wanted to see. As I say, that report said Floyd died from asphyxia, so lack of oxygen due to compression on his neck and back. It also found the death was a homicide, which isn't something that the post-mortem, the autopsy, should be responsible for. They are not there for the legal precedent. They are just there to examine the body and decide what they died from. So by all means, they died from asphyxia. They died from lack of oxygen. That's fine. But why was that? It could be a lack of function from the brain, the lungs, the heart, or the trachea, the air tube. It could be any one of those things. And if you've got too much adrenaline and therefore you go into shock and your muscles are spasming and therefore your lungs aren't functioning because of drug use, for example, then it's not because of compression on the neck or the back. If it's the heart isn't pumping properly in order to get the oxygen around the body, then again, it's because of the heart and not because of compression on the neck. So, sure, you can die from a lack of oxygen, but what is it that caused that? So they're saying compression on his neck and back. And the other one is saying that that isn't the case. So it seems like you've got comorbidities, because I know that's a really popular phrase, in order to decide what he died from. It is not the role of the post-mortem, the autopsy, to discern the law. It is just to decide what the individual died from. So, they both seem to agree that he died from a lack of oxygen. And then they differ, deciding what caused that lack of oxygen. We know that there were extraneous circumstances in that he was a drug user, he wasn't sober at the time, and he was middle-aged, and he had a history of drug abuse as well as run-ins with the law, so he wasn't an innocent man by any means. So trying to decide what killed him from a legal perspective is really out of the wheelhouse from the post-mortem destination. And of course the BBC mentioned a video showing a white police officer continue to kneel. Yeah, great. Brilliant race, because, hey, we clearly know that BBC, you're clearly trying to say that we should view people as individuals and not based on race, because you bring it up all the bloody time. And yes, in America there are fewer unarmed black people killed in police custody than white people, but per capita, then it is more black people per capita than white people. If you look at the amount of crime caused, and that's the 1350 rule, that despite being 13% of the population, black people commit 50% of the violent crime, then by all means, it does seem to see that, more black people are being disproportionately arrested and attacked by police. That is clearly racism. Is it? Or is it because these groups that have no father figure, that don't have the support, that are constantly being told that they're victims and that the world is against them, are actually resisting arrest and causing more crimes? Could it be that? Could it be down to individual action instead of skin colour? For fuck's sake, 3/4 of the police officers which were there at George Floyd's arrest were black. 3/4 of them, the majority of them. Are they being held responsible? Is it now black on black murders, because we know that that is the most prevalent thing in black neighbourhoods? No, of course it isn't. Instead, they're focusing on the white guy, because of course they are. They don't care for racial equality. They don't give a shit about that. All these legacy media outlets care for, like the BBC, like Washington Post, CNN, all of those, they care about dividing the country upon racial lines, upon class lines, upon sex lines, upon anything that they can draw a distinction from to try and have an us and them mentality. That is all they care for. They do not care for equality. Not at all. All they want is to be on the winning side of an argument. They want to join the most aggressive force because they think, if we're with the most aggressive force, then they're going to inflict the most damage, and therefore we'll be on the winning side. And if we're not on the winning side, then at least we're going to avoid these most aggressive attackers, and therefore we might be spared from their outrage. Unfortunately, that might not be the case, because we've already seen CNN headquarters being trashed. Of course, because it's not as if the rioters, and I'm not going to call them protesters, because at this point, I think you've really lost the right to be a protester. And we see the Washington Monument there, and we already know that there's been a long essay written about how somebody would take down such a monument. Not saying you should do it, not saying it's Washington, but hey, if it was, this would actually work perfectly, then yeah, and we've seen before with the Portland riots where liberals get the bullet too, that it doesn't seem as if these communists give a shit. And we've got Antifa rioting, and therefore we've had several factions already being grouped as a terrorist organization, and it seems as if it is going to be done more comprehensively by Trump. It's about time, because that is really what they deserve. After all that they've done, after trying to suggest that, oh, but we're anti-fascist, isn't everybody anti-fascist? It's like, well, yeah, pretty much we are. But we can't form a movement upon something that is anti-something else. So what is it that you stand for? Communism? Well, I'm against that as well, because fascism and communism are two branches of the same tree. If you look back at the influences for fascism, like Mussolini, like Hitler, sure, then you'll find it all stems from socialism. That you'll find, I believe it was Goebbels that's saying Hitler is the best in the world, and that the second one is Marx. Or it could be vice versa. Hitler was second best, second only to Marx. That the idea, or I think you mentioned Lenin as well, that among the National Socialists, they mention other socialists and communists. Would you believe it? That the fascist idea of the state controlling the means of production is drawn from socialist ideas. Would you believe it? Would you think that maybe they want to defend their country because they know that they can't afford to pay for the world, and therefore they just support their own country? And that's why, of course, they have satellite states like in the USSR. Would you believe it? Yeah, of course you would, because it is blatantly true. Fascism, National Socialism, communism, socialism, they're all the same ideology, just different points on the spectrum of how far they've gotten. That is it. The endpoint of communism, supposed to be anarchy, is bullshit, because whenever somebody gets that much power, it corrupts. And you might point out to rare figures of history, like, oh, what about Richard the Lionheart? What about him? So, well, yeah, it still didn't quite work, because even if you have one benevolent dictator, which he wasn't quite, that whoever inherits it then is unlikely to be such a godsend. It is so unlikely, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, that you're not going to be able to find a sustainable source like this. And whenever somebody develops such power and such wealth, like we saw with Fidel Castro, where he had so much in dollar bills just rotting away because he couldn't use it all, and being one of the richest men in the world, despite his people dying, as in the people of the country dying from starvation, that it's always the same. That they say, oh, I have got a great opportunity to amass a huge amount of wealth. Well, I guess I could take some of it, and then it ends up taking most of it. That is always the case. I don't trust people that much. I don't trust the government that much. I don't trust any individual that much to give them everything that I make in the hope that they're then going to appropriate it around so that everybody can survive fairly. Because it has never been shown to be true. And that is why capitalism is there so that somebody can be as selfish as they want, but if they're too selfish, because everything is out in the open, people will not support them because they can choose to not support them. But when it comes down to the government deciding how much you need to support them, they will then come down with men with guns in order to make sure that you support them. And so with this bloody riot coming about, it's not about the killing of George Floyd. It's on the 6th day. It definitely isn't. We see photos of burnings of places in Washington, and I believe it's either 16 or 22 different cities around America, and they're going into the suburbs. It's not just downtown. They're trying to break into the White House as well. And so you've got journalists who are scared for their lives. Any sort of conservative or right-wing journalist is now scared for their lives because they know that the police can't be there, and therefore they need to be able to protect themselves with deadly force, because they need a gun, because the police are going to be protecting either their own homes, because they care about themselves and their families, or the government, because at the end of the day, the government is there to protect the government. And therefore, if you're away from them, and there was rioting like this, and there were tens of thousands of rioters, and only a few hundred police, the police can't be everywhere, in which case, they're going to prioritise and protect themselves and the government, and not you. And therefore, you need to be able to defend yourself. So when you've got different states and counties and cities in America deciding different rules on what guns you can have, and how many rounds of ammunition you can have in your magazine. So, okay, great. So, Let's pick somewhere more strict, like California. You're only allowed 6 rounds in your magazine. Okay, you've got 12 rioters. Let's say you want to fire a couple of warning shots. So you fire a couple of warning shots. Not quite working. You want to fire a couple more. That maybe angers them. You've got 2 shots left. You've got 12 rioters. You don't want to kill anyone. So maybe you can shoot a couple in the leg. You've then got to unscrew the magazine, I kid you not, in order to then put in another one and screw it in, and then be able to try to defend yourself. Otherwise, you do need several different guns. And that has been the answer. You cannot change the magazine sufficiently quickly. The magazine does not have enough rounds to be reliable, and therefore you need various guns lined up. If you're a single woman, on her own, trying to defend herself, then it is advised that you have to be able to somehow be able to afford loaded guns in every single room of your house, just in case. Because you know that you're physically weaker than men, and especially if you've got a group of people coming in, then you need to be able to have something to hand wherever you are in order to defend yourself, and be able to then run to another gun because it's quicker than reloading in order to then take on any more attackers. So if you're trying to be nice by firing warning shots because you know that the police are several hours away because they're defending themselves, then you need to be able to defend yourself. And if you're limiting the side of magazines because you're trying to protect people, then all you're protecting are the rioters and not the people that are trying to defend their own properties and their lives. And yes, I know with coronavirus, they're like, well, we've got to keep people in quarantine. We can't allow them to work because lives are at risk. So, well, livelihoods, clues in the name of live, it's what keeps people living, being able to produce things. If we remove the economy, if people are unable to produce, then if they're self-sustaining, they're not allowed to farm in order to get the food for themselves. They are dead. You have killed them out of starvation, just like we've seen the Holodomor of Ukraine under the USSR. That is what we've seen. And the same goes here, that you're not allowing people to defend themselves against rioters because you want to protect lives. You're protecting the rioters and not protecting the person who's trying to defend their property. So like, oh, well, the property isn't the person. It's like, yeah, sure, but once you've got 12 people in your property, what are you going to do? At that point, surely you've got to fight back. And if you've got some where you have an obligation to a gun and you don't have the man in his castle defense, how are you supposed to keep yourself safe? We've seen dozens of people killed already from the rioting. This is not an appropriate response to the death. It is not about George Floyd's death. This is nothing to avenge him. It is nothing to suggest that getting this new TV for Walmart suddenly makes the memory of George Floyd better and makes him feel so much better. It isn't anything like that. And yet these continue on. And now they're coming over to the UK as well. And it has gotten way out of control, and that's why the National Guard has been called in, which people were warned of on Twitter, but Twitter decided to censor it, because apparently it was glorifying violence, even though it was Donald Trump warning people what was going to happen. And that was their response. So no wonder we need the executive order in order to say, you're either a platform or a publisher. Do you want to get sued for things on your platform because you're publishing and editorializing and deciding what can go, in which case you're responsible for everything? Or instead, do you want to allow people to speak their mind as being a public square or church notice board, a parish council, ideas? It's up to you, but decide. Because if you keep editorializing, we're going to be able to sue you for everything on your website. And good luck living through that. But if instead you want to actually allow people to speak their mind, then hey, we've got some things we want to say. But that's about it for now. I guess all I can really say as advice for you is just keep yourself safe. There are riots happening. You need to know something in order to be able to defend yourself and the ones you love. And this is really where the supposed patriarchy is going to come out in force, whereby we're going to see everybody, even the ardent feminists, looking to men to protect themselves. So as I know that most of you are men, it's down to you to be able to protect the ones you love and your families. So don't put yourself in danger, but obviously you know what you're willing to live for and what you're willing to die for. And any self-respecting man is obviously willing to die for the ones that he loves. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, but at this point, it doesn't seem like we can rely on the media or the police for anything sensible. So it's really down to yourself and what you stand for. Just please, please keep yourself safe. And until next time, as best you can, have a good one.